They pointed loaded guns at her, not in an alley, not in a confrontation. In the middle of a military funeral, Admiral Celeste Munro, a 4-star naval officer, had no warning, no verification, no shame. It was a rift, proof that in America, not even a uniform, not even a rank, not even the hallowed ground of Arlington could protect a racist black woman. What happened next would shake the halls of Congress, ignite a national movement, and transform Celeste Munro from a grieving leader into a reckoning the system had not foreseen. This story will change your mind if you think justice only exists in the courtroom. Like if you agree with Admiral Munro, comment below if you're sick of mistakes that always look the same. Subscribe now to follow stories like this, because the next one might be closer to home than you think. The sky was a muted gray, the kind of color that seems to absorb sound. Overhead, clouds hung low like solemn witnesses to the grief below. At Arlington National Cemetery, rows of white marble headstones stretched into the distance like an eternal formation, precise, unmoving, proud. Admiral Celeste Munro, age 59, stood still amid the silence. Her presence alone was enough to shift the energy of any room, or in this case, a national burial ground. Dressed in her full navy whites, decorated with medals from 3 decades of service, she stood beside a flag-draped casket at the head of a small gathering. Her uniform was immaculate. Her expression was unreadable. But behind the aviator shades and the rigid posture was a woman who had just lost a brother in arms, a student, a friend. Commander Elijah Benton was not just another name carved into stone. He had been the first officer Celeste ever personally recruited out of Annapolis. She'd watched him rise. She'd scolded him for reckless decisions, toasted his promotions. And now, she was here to say goodbye. He was only 43. An IED in southern Kandahar had ended everything. No warning, no chance. Just silence. The air was heavy with ceremony. Soldiers from every branch stood shoulder to shoulder, an unbroken line of silent tribute. Some were civilians in suits, others were officers in dress blues or greens. The bugler stood at the ready, horn in hand, waiting to release the final note. And in the front row, Elijah's mother, a woman with silver-streaked hair and tearful eyes, clutched the folded flag in both hands as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Celeste's boots crunched lightly on the frost-hardened grass as she slowly stepped forward. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't grieving, but because she'd learned over the years how to channel pain into presence. She carried more than her sorrow, the weight of the fallen, the dignity of the uniform, and the eyes of those who still believed service meant something sacred. She knelt beside the casket, her white-gloved hand resting gently atop the polished wood. A silent prayer, not one born from religion, but from memory, from the countless letters she had written to families, from the funerals where she had delivered eulogies, from the folded flags she had handed out with trembling fingers to mothers, fathers, wives, and children. And now, here she was, the one left behind. "I will not let your name disappear," she whispered, the wind almost stealing the words. Behind her, not a soul moved. Even the breeze seemed to pause in reverence. To most Americans, Celeste Munro was a name in the paper, a ribbon on the news ticker beneath a presidential press conference. But to those in uniform, especially those who looked like her, she was something more. A symbol. She had been the first black woman in the Navy's upper echelon to command a fleet of carriers, the kind of leader who walked the halls of the Pentagon and left silence in her wake. A woman who had been called intimidating by those who couldn't match her intelligence, and too much by those who resented her authority. She didn't raise her voice unless she needed to. But when she did, even admirals paused. Yet, beside Elijah's casket, she was just a friend saying goodbye. A warrior grieving another. Celeste's gaze drifted upward as the honor guard lifted their rifles for the 21-gun salute. Clouds drifted slowly, heavy with unshed rain. The first volley cracked through the air like a lightning bolt. She didn't flinch. The second followed, then the third. In each echo, she heard years of sacrifice. In each silence after, she heard the names of the lost. She thought about the letters she still kept. One from a soldier who told her she was the reason he didn't give up on himself. Another from a mother whose son, Celeste, had been personally mentored. Most recently, Elijah's last message, forwarded by his commanding officer, was sent just days before his death. "Tell Admiral Monroe I finally got promoted. You were right. I wasn't ready then. I am now." Celeste hadn't deleted that email. She never would. The bugler raised the horn. The first note of taps slid through the still air. Soft, mournful, crystalline. Somewhere behind her, someone sniffled. Another cleared their throat. But Celeste didn't move. Each note built into the next like a farewell whispered across time. It was the same song she had heard at too many burials, and somehow it always cut deeper with each name, each time. Because no two funerals were ever truly the same, not when you had known the person inside the box. When the final note faded, there was nothing but silence. And that's when it happened. A voice. Sharp. Misplaced. Loud. "Get down! Hands where I can see them!" The silence that followed the bugler's last note had been sacred. Reverent. It was the kind of quiet you didn't dare break. Not at Arlington. Not in front of the fallen. And yet the silence had been shattered. "Get down! Hands where I can see them!" The command cracked through the air like a whip. Heads turned sharply, brows furrowed, hearts skipping beats. No one understood at first. The voice hadn't come from a soldier. It didn't belong to an officer paying respects. It came from a uniformed cop. Sergeant Rick Dalton, tall, mid-40s, white, mirrored sunglasses, and a rigid jaw set like stone. His voice rang with authority. But the wrong kind, not reverence, not protection, control. He had his gun drawn, pointed. At Admiral Celeste Monroe. For a split second, time fractured. People blinked, unsure of what they were seeing. Was this part of the ceremony? A security drill? A mistake? But then the second officer, nervous, younger, white, Officer Caleb Bird, stepped up beside Dalton, eyes darting between his partner and the sea of decorated officers frozen in disbelief. Celeste didn't flinch. Not even a muscle. She stood beside Elijah's casket, her back straight, her white-gloved hands resting calmly in front of her. Dalton's voice barked again. "I said hands up! Now!" The wind held its breath. So did everyone else. A murmur rippled through the crowd like distant thunder. The honor guard, still in formation, shifted uncomfortably. Two Navy captains exchanged glances. One clenched his jaw. A Marine colonel in the second row took a half-step forward before stopping himself. This wasn't just unorthodox. It was offensive. Outrageous. But more than that, it was dangerous. A weapon. A funeral. A gun was aimed at one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Navy. A black woman in full uniform, standing at a military funeral, was being treated like a suspect in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom owed their very lives and careers to her leadership. The disrespect was staggering. The implications are worse. Finally, Admiral Monroe turned her head slightly. Her voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that only years in command could forge. "Officer," she said, her tone even and controlled. "Lower your weapon. You're making a mistake." Sergeant Dalton's grip didn't budge. He stepped closer. "You're not supposed to be here," he snapped. We got a report of suspicious behavior. Step away from the casket, now." It was so absurd, so grotesquely misjudged, that several people gasped aloud. "Suspicious behavior?" a Navy commander muttered under his breath. "She's the Admiral," someone else whispered. "She's the one presiding over the funeral?" But Dalton didn't hear it. Or worse, he didn't care. He saw one thing: a tall black woman at the center of a solemn crowd, standing near a flag-draped casket. He didn't see the ribbons on her chest, didn't see the rank on her shoulders. Or maybe he did, and thought none of it mattered. Beside him, Officer Byrd shifted again, clearly shaken. "Sergeant," he said quietly, voice uncertain. "Maybe we should—" "Quiet," Dalton snapped, never taking his eyes off Celeste. She was seen speaking near the casket, moving around alone, could have been interfering with the crime scene. Someone from the crowd couldn't contain it anymore. "This isn't a crime scene," a retired lieutenant shouted. "This is a funeral, damn it!" From the front row, Mrs. Benton, Elijah's mother, stood shakily. Her hands trembled, still wrapped around the folded flag of her son. Her voice cracked, raw with disbelief. "She's here for my son," she said. "You don't know what you're doing." But Dalton didn't budge. His posture remained rigid. His finger hovered far too close to the trigger. "She's resisting," he declared. "She's ignoring direct orders. If you don't get on the ground, I will be forced to detain you." A stunned hush. And then, Celeste took one step forward. Not a flinch. Not a threat. Just a quiet step. That was all it took to make Dalton jerk his weapon higher. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. But Celeste's voice remained low, smooth, unbroken. "I am Admiral Celeste Monroe, United States Navy. This is not just misconduct. It is an assault on military protocol. And on me." The name rippled like a thunderclap. Monroe? The soldiers and officers in attendance knew that name. Some had served under her. Others had heard her speak at Pentagon briefings or read her published doctrine on combat logistics and interbranch cohesion. She was a legend in her own right, and now she was being treated like a threat. Dalton's face twisted, not in understanding but something closer to resentment. He spat the words like they tasted wrong in his mouth. "Admiral or not, you're obstructing an active investigation." Celeste's jaw tightened slightly. Still, she didn't raise her voice. "And what exactly am I being accused of, officer?" Dalton hesitated. The question cut deeper than expected. The illusion of justification had begun to crack. A beat of silence. Then another. And then, Colonel Lucille Grant, a decorated Army officer with 3 tours in Afghanistan and a commendation for valor, stepped forward from the honor guard. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're pointing a weapon at a senior officer, Sergeant. I suggest you holster that firearm immediately before this becomes a career-ending decision." Dalton turned, sneered, but the flicker of doubt was undeniable. Byrd stepped back, quietly lowering his hand from his holster. Sweat ran down the side of his temple. A Navy SEAL captain in the 3rd row whispered, "He just doesn't get it." As if sensing the weight of every grave around them, the wind picked up, rustling the flags, the coats, the silence. Cameras had started rolling now, phones raised quietly, respectfully, but deliberately. The world would see this. And Celeste, never blinking, never backing down, let that reality settle in the space between her and the man who had dared to question her right to mourn. "I suggest," she said, "you think very carefully about your next move, Sergeant Dalton." The moment Deputy Director Marcus Reed stepped forward, something shifted in the marrow of the scene. Not just because of who he was, a high-ranking figure in Homeland Security with deep intelligence ties and national oversight responsibilities, but because of how he moved. Not with anger, not with panic, but with certainty. The same certainty came from decades of standing between chaos and justice without flinching. "Sergeant Dalton," he repeated, his voice level but cold enough to bite through the wind. I said, "Stand down." Dalton hesitated. He turned his head toward Reed, his jaw locked in that half-snarl expression that men wear when they realize they're over their heads too late. But even as his hand shook near the trigger, you could see it. He knew the line had been crossed. Celeste Monroe still hadn't moved. She stood perfectly still beside the casket, her uniform sharp and immaculate, a visual rebuke to the absurdity of Dalton's accusation. In her stillness was command. In her restraint, unmatched strength. But now, the burden of action had shifted to Reed. He stepped closer, like you would with a dangerous animal, not because he was afraid, but because he understood. Reckless men with power often don't realize how harmful they are until it's too late. "You pulled a weapon on a senior military officer during a funeral," Reed said calmly. "You aimed a loaded firearm at a decorated admiral in front of uniformed service members, grieving family, and civilians. That's not an overstep. That's a crisis of judgment." Dalton scoffed, but said nothing. His raised weapon had begun to look less like authority and more like a threat flailing in plain sight. Officer Byrd, the younger cop, looked at the grass, his hands fidgeting, his mouth dry. Sir, he said to Reed, "we had a report of a suspicious person lingering near the casket." Reed cut him off with a single glance. "And did either of you verify her identity before engaging?" Byrd froze. "No, sir." Reed turned back to Dalton. "Did you assess the scene? Ask a single question? Speak to a single officer already in uniform?" Dalton stiffened. She was acting strange. "And what does that mean?" Reed asked, genuinely curious. "She was quiet? Alone? Black?" Dalton's face flushed, but he didn't respond. The crowd was silent, but the air was full of unspoken agreement. "We see you, not just Dalton, but the system that let him believe he could walk into a funeral and point a gun at an admiral without consequences." Colonel Lucille Grant stepped up beside Celeste, arms crossed, the decorations on her chest shimmering under the gray light. "I served under her," Grant said, her voice firm but quiet. "I flew combat missions under her command. I trusted her with my life. You think a woman like that is suspicious? That's not just reckless. It's disrespectful." Dalton looked cornered. "I didn't know who she was." Celeste finally spoke, each word deliberate and sharp as a scalpel. "You didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to recognize that I was mourning. That should have been enough." Her words landed like truth, slamming into a hollow echo chamber. Dalton blinked. "Let me guess," Celeste continued. "A black woman in a high-security event made you uncomfortable. You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You didn't think. You acted on the oldest reflex in the American handbook, fear, draped in authority." The crowd, still silent, burned with invisible heat. Another figure emerged from the far side of the procession. Rear Admiral Quentin McNally, Celeste's longtime peer, known for his no-nonsense discipline and moral steel. His voice boomed without needing volume. "I don't care what department you're with," he said, addressing Dalton directly. "You do not point a gun at a senior naval officer without cause." Dalton's bravado began to crumble. The wall of blue and gold uniforms that now formed behind Celeste wasn't just a statement. It was a reckoning. "These men and women don't just follow Admiral Monroe," McNally continued. "They stand with her, right now, right here." Dalton lowered the weapon a few inches, slowly. But it wasn't over. Decision at the edge. Reed stepped between Dalton and Celeste, arms raised, voice low. "Sergeant, here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand that weapon to Officer Byrd. You're going to remove yourself from this ceremony, and you're going to pray to whatever God you believe in that internal affairs doesn't move faster than I do." Dalton hesitated. His fingers twitched near the trigger, but something in some flicker of logic or survival finally clicked. He turned and handed the gun to Bird. No words, just a silence, soaked in shame. Then, without looking at anyone, he stepped backward into the grass, jaw clenched, sweat streaking down his temple. Alone, isolated, and finished. Reed exhaled. "Admiral," he said softly, turning back to Celeste. "Permission to resume the ceremony." She nodded once, eyes still locked on the casket. "Permission granted." The tension broke like a fever. The bugler returned to position. The honor guard reset. And slowly, the sounds of dignity returned. The low thump of boots, the piercing clarity of the final bugle call, the flutter of the flag in a reluctant wind. Celeste stood motionless, a sentinel for Elijah Benton and every soldier, sailor, and citizen whose dignity had been questioned for simply existing. The headlines hit before the sun did. Decorated Admiral held at gunpoint during funeral, DHS and Navy launch investigation. Racial profiling at Arlington, 4-star hero confronted in uniform. Ceremony of shame. Who pulled a gun on Admiral Monroe? By 6:15 a.m., cable networks had broken into their regular segments. By 7 o'clock a.m., it was front page across every major outlet. But it was never just the story. It was the image. A still from the funeral. Admiral Celeste Monroe, standing tall, back straight, face calm. Sergeant Dalton's weapon inches from her chest, a folded flag blurred in the background. It didn't need a caption. It spoke louder than 1,000 op-eds. At coffee shops in D.C., patrons sat with their cups untouched, their brows furrowed as they read. On social media, outrage took shape like wildfire, concise, relentless, and personal. If they'll pull a gun on her, what chance do the rest of us have? A funeral, in full uniform, and they still saw a threat. Celeste Monroe has more stars than that cop has IQ points. But beneath the surface of rage was something more profound. A growing realization that, for all the pledges, reforms, and commissions, nothing had changed. Not when a black woman in a decorated admiral's uniform could be treated like a trespasser on sacred ground. By mid-morning, the White House press secretary was forced to address the incident. "We are aware of the video and the images," she said carefully. "The president has been briefed. Let me be clear. This administration has the utmost respect for Admiral Monroe and her service. We support a full and transparent investigation." It wasn't enough. Not for the press pool or the public. The questions kept coming. Why was she targeted? Was this racial profiling? Will the officer be charged? Has the president spoken to her? The press secretary dodged, but the public had already made up its mind. Deputy Director Marcus Reed stood at the edge of his office window at Homeland Security Headquarters, watching the Capitol in the distance. His jaw was tight. His phone buzzed non-stop with senators, generals, advocacy groups, and even corporate leaders. Everyone wanted the same thing: answers. Across town, the Pentagon was in lockdown mode. The Joint Chiefs had called an emergency briefing about the breach of protocol and trust. Rear Admiral Quentin McNally sat at the head of the room, arms folded. "We have a problem," he began, "and her name is not Celeste Monroe. It's Sergeant Dalton. And everything he did is now our problem." Across the table, General Shaw, Navy JAG, spoke next. "The footage is damning. His firearm was drawn for almost 2 minutes, never holstered, never de-escalated, no verification, just escalation." "Why?" someone asked. The answer came from a civilian policy advisor who barely looked old enough to shave. "Because she was black. That's it. That's the whole answer." Silence. Admiral Monroe didn't respond to the press. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't tweet. She went back to work. But her silence wasn't absence. It was presence. A quiet, controlled demonstration of who held power now. And that silence made the noise even louder. Her office received over 600 letters in 24 hours. Some are veterans. Others are from grieving military families. And many from ordinary Americans, black women in particular, who saw themselves in that funeral photo and felt every ounce of its humiliation. One letter read, "They tried to make you a victim, but you stayed an officer. You gave us all a spine that morning." Another, "I buried my husband at Arlington last year. I wore a dress uniform. I never let go of the fear. You just turned that fear into fire." Back in his small precinct in Prince George's County, Sergeant Dalton sat at a steel desk in an internal affairs room, eyes sunken, shirt wrinkled. Across from him sat 2 military JAG lawyers and an officer from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. There were no greetings or condolences, just a folder on the table. Inside, video stills, sworn statements, chain of command reports. One page in particular had a large red stamp. "Grounds for dismissal." Dalton opened his mouth to speak, but one of the military lawyers raised a hand. "This isn't your interrogation," she said. "This is your notification." He swallowed. His voice trembled. "I didn't know who she was." The other lawyer leaned forward. "You didn't need to know who she was. You just needed to not treat her like a suspect at a funeral." In neighborhoods across the country, especially among veterans and black communities, the image of the funeral standoff became something more profound. Not just a story, a symbol. Churches held candlelight vigils, not just for Major Elijah Benton, the man whose funeral had been violated, but for every black service member who returned home and was met not with gratitude, but suspicion. Outside a federal courthouse in Atlanta, retired Sergeant Carla Green held up a sign. "Decorated, not dangerous." At a town hall in Detroit, a mother clutched her son's ROTC cap and asked through tears, "If that's how they treat her, what happens to my boy when he wears his?" Admiral Monroe agreed to a single sit-down interview 2 days after the funeral. It was aired live on every network. She wore her uniform, again. Her voice was calm. Her tone was deliberate. Her posture is regal. "I wasn't surprised," she said simply. The anchor blinked. "You weren't?" Celeste shook her head. "I was disappointed, but not surprised. When I first enlisted, I was told that my uniform would protect and define me and command respect. But I've learned this. For some people, no rank, no ribbon, no years of service will ever outweigh the fear they see in the color of my skin." Silence. "But here's the truth," she continued. "I didn't come here to punish Sergeant Dalton. I came to bury a hero, a man I trained, a man who gave his life in service. I was there for him. And Sergeant Dalton decided that was suspicious." She leaned forward. "This isn't about one officer. It's about all the ways we still allow power to go unchecked. That changes now, because if I can't be safe in uniform, then no one can." The storm that began at Arlington didn't fade. It evolved. It sharpened. It organized. By the morning of the 5th day, justice. For Celeste had topped international trends, but hashtags weren't enough anymore. Protesters were no longer gathering at city halls or county precincts. They were showing up in suits. The halls of Congress were filling with heat. A reprint. Angela Fletcher of Georgia leaned into the microphone at a Capitol subcommittee on federal oversight. Her tone was even, but her words crackled like wire. "We all saw it. A 4-star admiral, a funeral, a gun was drawn, and not one valid reason. So I ask you, what policies are in place to stop it from happening again? Not to a general, to anyone." The committee chamber stirred. Senators exchanged glances. Across the room, DHS Director Miles Richmond adjusted his tie and tried to keep his hands from trembling. Behind him, Celeste Monroe sat in silence. Up until now, Celeste has remained mostly quiet. Her public statements have been measured, and her demeanor is regal. But that was the point. She wasn't asking for justice. She was watching who would offer it. Each day since the incident, she had received hundreds of direct messages from military families, from former police officers, from lawmakers, and, more quietly, from whistleblowers. People inside the system. People are tired of watching the same story repeat with different names. "Ma'am, I can't say this on the record, but the officer who drew on you? He wasn't acting alone. Check the call logs. You'll see who authorized him to be there. He was tipped off, told to watch the perimeter. Someone wanted him there." Celeste listened, catalogued, waited. Because now this wasn't about one rogue officer. It was about infrastructure, and its cracks were beginning to show. Outside the Capitol, the crowd had doubled since the day before. It was no longer a spontaneous gathering. Now it was a coalition. Veterans stood beside black mothers, clergy next to lawyers, and off-duty military beside grassroots organizers. One woman wore her navy dress blues and held up a sign that simply read, "Uniforms shouldn't need armor from racism." Another, a teenage boy in ROTC, held a handmade poster. "She fought for us. We fight for her." Media vans flanked the block. Drones hovered, and on every screen the phrase began to surface. Arlington wasn't an anomaly. It was a mirror. In a closed-door briefing, Representative Tom Harrow, a senior Republican from Texas and a former Army officer, stood with his arms crossed, his voice low but firm. "Gentlemen, this isn't just optics. This is a policy failure. You put a gun to the face of someone who outranks most of the Pentagon. What does that say to every enlisted black man who walks to 7-Eleven in uniform?" The room went quiet. Then came the fallout. 2 House oversight hearings were scheduled. DHS launched a top-down internal audit of incident escalation protocols. DOJ announced a preliminary investigation into the department that employed Sergeant Dalton. Celeste Monroe was formally invited to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and while cameras waited for her response, she didn't step out and grandstand. She sent one sentence in a written statement: "I accept. I'm not coming for revenge. I'm coming for reform." Sergeant Dalton sat in his lawyer's office with his head in his hands. The backlash hadn't just scorched his career, it had vaporized it. His GoFundMe campaign, quietly set up by a fringe supporter group, was pulled by the platform within hours due to ethics violations. His department had disavowed him, and his union rep had stopped returning calls. And now, worse, the family of Major Elijah Benton, the man whose funeral he desecrated, was preparing a civil suit for emotional trauma and public disruption of military honors. Dalton looked up from the news. "They're going to destroy me." His lawyer didn't respond. Because, yes, they were. Behind the scenes, Admiral Monroe had begun meeting with defense analysts and legal scholars to discuss what happened at the funeral and what allowed it to happen. What patterns were overlooked? What training was skipped? What biases were embedded deep in the enforcement manuals? By the end of the week, her office released a 12-page policy recommendation paper titled, "The Arlington Protocol: Preventing Bias-Based Misconduct in Federal Military Intersections." It wasn't emotional. It was meticulous. Redesign use of force thresholds near federal ceremonies. Require ID confirmation before escalation. Mandate cross-agency protocol training on military recognition for all precincts adjacent to military sites. Create an independent watchdog task force to audit misconduct cases involving service members. The press ate it up. More importantly, so did 2 senators. And a governor. It was no longer a scandal. It was a movement. On day 8, Celeste received an encrypted message through a back channel she hadn't used in years. The source is anonymous, but it contained one thing: an internal memo from the day of the funeral. Deploy unit near perimeter of Arlington Site, 14B. Monitor all attendees. Flag unverified vehicles. Priority: high. No name attached. No reason given. But the timestamp? 45 minutes before Sergeant Dalton ever arrived. Someone had tipped him. Someone had sent him. And Celeste now had the receipt. The doors to the Senate Judiciary Committee chamber opened with the solemn gravity of a trial. But this wasn't just another hearing. This was a reckoning. The crowd inside was uncharacteristically silent for a room so packed. C-SPAN cameras were rolling, and significant networks were live streaming. Students watched from civics classes, retired veterans tuned in from their living rooms, and active service members, some still in uniform, streamed the footage from overseas. At the center of it all, Admiral Celeste Monroe, 61, rose slowly from her seat. She wore her full dress uniform, not for pageantry, but for precision. The stars on her collar glinted under the chamber's soft light. Her posture was steel, and her expression unreadable. But her eyes? They held the fire of a woman who had led troops into war and was now leading the nation into a moment of truth. Chairman Whitlock, a seasoned Democrat with a war hero father and a no-nonsense demeanor, cleared his throat into the microphone. Admiral Monroe, thank you for joining us. We understand this may be difficult, and we are grateful for your willingness to speak. Celeste nodded once, firmly. Chairman, I've led men and women into battle with nothing but a compass and conviction. She glanced at the crowd behind the senators, the press, the families watching from gallery seats. This is not difficult. It's necessary. The room went still. Her voice was low but deliberate, wrapped in clarity and controlled fire. I am not here today because I want to be, Celeste began, folding her hands on the table before her. I am here because I was forced to be. Not by my command, not by foreign enemies, but by a man with a badge and a weapon who believed that the color of my skin overrode the rank on my uniform. A quiet gasp echoed through the chamber. No dramatics. Just the truth, spoken plainly. At the funeral of Major Elijah Benton, one of our own, I was treated not as a leader, not even as a citizen, but as a threat. My only offense was standing too close to a flag-draped casket while black. Senator Collins, a conservative from Arkansas, cleared his throat. Admiral, with respect, is it possible the officer didn't recognize you? She turned toward him, calm as a glass lake. That is exactly the problem, Senator. Recognition should not be the prerequisite for respect. Whether a general or a janitor, I was a woman mourning a fallen soldier, and I was profiled. The chamber was dead quiet. A younger senator, perhaps trying to pivot the discussion, asked, What would you have us do, Admiral? We can't police every thought in an officer's head. Celeste didn't blink. You're right. You can't police thoughts, but you can police patterns. You can track abuse. You can remove those who wear their power like a weapon. You can reimagine training, reform escalation protocols, and close the gap between law enforcement and public trust. She paused. Or you can do nothing, and wait for the next funeral to turn into a crime scene. That landed like a gavel. Then, quietly, Celeste opened a leather-bound folder in front of her. What I'm submitting to the record today are not just my words. They are documents, internal emails, dispatch transcripts, whistleblower statements, including a preemptive directive to monitor all unverified vehicles at Arlington National Cemetery, the morning I was held at gunpoint. She lifted a thin printed page between two fingers. This directive came from an unnamed supervisor whose authorization aligned with my arrival by less than 45 minutes. This was not a random encounter. I was a target. Gasps turned into stunned silence. Chairman Whitlock leaned forward. Are you implying this was coordinated? Celeste locked eyes with him. I'm not implying it, sir. I'm documenting it. As the testimony unfolded, the internet lit up in real time. The hashtag #HatchArlington was a setup began to climb. Political pundits stopped mid-broadcast to relay her claims. Veterans groups demanded an investigation into the buried chain of command that led to that day. The Secretary of Defense stated within the hour, Admiral Monroe's testimony will receive our full cooperation and respect. The hearing wasn't just exposing a single act. It was exposing a system of silence, and the nation was watching it unravel in real time. As she neared the end of her time, Celeste turned her attention to the chamber. We don't need performative reform. We need real policy with enforcement teeth, civilian oversight with military input, departmental audits. Psychological screening is not just at entry, but at intervals, and full transparency when incidents like this occur, not just because the victim wears stars on their collar. She scanned the panel. Because if it can happen to me, it has already happened to others. The only difference is, I had a camera, and a rank that finally made people care. Senator Harrow, the Republican veteran who had remained quiet, finally spoke. His voice cracked slightly. Admiral, you just described my father. He wore 2 stars, and he once told me, son, the greatest fight I ever had was with a system that didn't see me until I bled for it. Celeste softened, just a fraction. Then let's stop asking our heroes to bleed before we see them. The committee room stood still for several long beats. Finally, Chairman Whitlock spoke again. Admiral Monroe, on behalf of this committee and, frankly, this nation, thank you. Celeste stood slowly. She did not smile. She did not bow. She simply said, we don't salute dysfunction. We correct it. And with that, she turned, her shoulders squared, her head high, and walked out of the chamber with the grace of a general and the force of a revolution. The backlash didn't wait for morning. Before Admiral Celeste Monroe's shoes had even left the Senate marble steps, forces were already moving behind closed doors. Phone calls made, old acquaintances reactivated, favors pulled from dusty drawers labeled, "Quiet down now." She had walked into the chamber as a truth teller. She walked out as a threat. And the system she had exposed? It was beginning to bare its teeth. By midnight, whispers had turned into coordinated messages. She's grandstanding. She's too emotional. She's got an agenda. Conservative networks looped clips from the hearing, but not the damning evidence. Just the moments where her voice rose, her eyes sharpened, twisting her steel into volatility. One headline read, Admiral or activist? Critics question Monroe's intentions. Another, when decorated turns defiant. And then the deeper machinery rumbled to life. By dawn, a decades-old image was circulating online. Celeste, in her 20s, raising a fist at a campus protest, jaw tight, eyes furious. The cause had been a student-led opposition to a local police brutality case in Atlanta. Peaceful, lawful, but now reframed with ominous captions. The radical roots of a Navy admiral. Is this the real Celeste Monroe? The smear campaign had begun. Emails to reporters hinted at classified decisions she had made during her deployment years. Anonymous sources claimed she had disciplinary conflicts in her early commands. None of it was verifiable. None of it was substantiated. But that was never the point. The goal wasn't to destroy her outright. It was to muddy the water, to make the public doubt. By the end of the week, Celeste's assistant, Lieutenant Maya Chen, opened an envelope with no return address. Inside, a photo of Celeste taken 2 days ago, walking her dog in her neighborhood. Scrawled on the back, "You bark loudly. Let's hope you don't bite. Maya brought it into Celeste's office, her hands trembling. Ma'am, I think this is a threat. Celeste took the photo, eyes narrowing. She didn't flinch, but she didn't shrug it off either. Get security on the house. I want eyes on every entrance, and from now on you ride with me. That night, Celeste received a call from Rear Admiral Kenneth Burrell, an old-school Navy officer who was politically cautious and the kind of man who wore medals like armor, but rarely took a side. Celeste, he said, voice taut. They're coming after you. Let them, she replied. This isn't a street fight. These people play chess with careers. Celeste was quiet for a long moment. Then I'll play with a longer memory. Burrell sighed. They're already digging into your budget approvals, procurement signatures, anything they can twist into misconduct. This isn't about right or wrong, it's about survival. Then they've chosen the wrong opponent. 2 days later, a memo leaked to a defense blog claimed Celeste's division had misappropriated $2.3 million in tactical gear funds during her previous command. No hard evidence, no source named. But the insinuation was enough. Congressional staffers started whispering about an internal review. Twitter boiled over. Hashtags flipped. Some of the same platforms that had once cheered her testimony now danced on the edge of scandal. Admiral Monroe, the truth teller, now rebranded, at least by the machine, as a headline waiting to collapse. The following Monday, Celeste was summoned to a closed-door discussion at the Pentagon. 3 men are in tailored suits, and 1 woman is from Naval Legal Affairs. They offered coffee and folded their hands politely. This isn't disciplinary, one said. Just a review. A procedural check, added another, standard following such a high-profile statement. Celeste sat still. You're not here to review. You're here to contain. Awkward glances. A chuckle too forced. Now, Celeste? She cut him off. It's Admiral. And just like that, the tone in the room changed. I've seen this play before, she continued. You plant doubt, trigger audits, throw smoke, and hope I blink. She stood slowly. But I don't blink, not when lives are on the line, not when justice is at stake. And certainly not for men who mistake rank for relevance. She walked out. No coffee was touched. No permission asked. That night, a military family posted a video to TikTok. The father is a reservist. The mother is holding a baby. Behind them, the American flag and a screen playing the moment from the hearing when Celeste said, "Recognition should not be the prerequisite for respect." They spoke simply. We want our daughter to grow up in a country where her worth isn't tied to her rank, uniform, or skin color. Thank you, Admiral Monroe, for speaking when others stay silent. The video hit 2 million views overnight. By the end of the week, petitions had emerged in support of Celeste. Veteran groups released statements of solidarity. A coalition of retired generals signed an open letter calling for an investigation, not into Monroe, but into the officers who drew on her at a soldier's funeral. Public sentiment began to shift again. Because while power knows how to punish, people remember how to rise when shown the truth. Maya caught her boss staring at a whiteboard in her office one evening. On it were 3 columns. They did, they're doing, they'll try. Under each, bullet points, tactics, patterns, names. Are you building a case? Maya asked. Celeste didn't look away from the board. No, she replied softly. I'm building a firewall. Then she turned, her eyes sharper than Maya had ever seen. If they think this is about me, they've already lost. What had started as a crack in the system was now a fault line stretching across the nation. By the time Admiral Celeste Monroe stepped onto the campus of Howard University to give her first public address since the Senate testimony, the air outside the auditorium buzzed with tension. And something else. Hope. Crowds had gathered in the rain, faces lifted toward the screen above the steps where her speech would be streamed live. Students stood next to veterans, activists next to cadets. Even police officers, off-duty in plain clothes, stood toward the back, arms crossed, silent. The world was watching. And this time Celeste was no longer speaking for herself. 2 nights before the event, a formal complaint was filed against her. It came from a congressional subcommittee, not bipartisan, impartial, and unexpected. The document accused Celeste Monroe of politicizing her uniform, endangering military neutrality, and compromising the chain of command. But even the press release smelled of desperation, because hours later, someone leaked internal messages between the subcommittee's lead investigator and a Pentagon staffer. One message read, "We have to shut her up before this spreads." And just like that, the fire they tried to smother ignited into a blaze. Veterans groups rallied. Civil rights coalitions published joint statements. Social media turned into a digital town hall. The #Monroe doctrine, once used only by policy wonks, was reborn as a rallying cry. A viral tweet read, "She led us in battle. She's leading us again. This time, the enemy wears a badge of silence." Protests erupted in 10 cities. Not violent, not chaotic, just people, thousands of them, marching under signs that read, "Respect without recognition isn't respect at all." Justice is not a disruption. "We see you, Admiral." Inside the auditorium, the lights dimmed. The audience fell still. Celeste stepped up to the podium. No uniform this time. Just a plain dark blue blazer, a simple lapel pin, and her voice. "You know," she began, "when I stood before the Senate, I thought that would be the loudest moment of my life. Turns out it was just the sound check." Laughter rippled gently, then faded. "Let me tell you why I'm here. Not because of a rank, not because of a badge. I'm here because too many have stood silent, while power rewrote the rules. I didn't ask to be profiled. I didn't volunteer to have a weapon pointed at me at a funeral, but I will never apologize for how I responded to it." She paused. "They say I disrupted order, but what they really mean is, I disrupted control." The room erupted, and when it settled, she continued, "I'm not just fighting for justice for myself. I'm fighting so that the next officer, soldier, and citizen don't have to wait for a badge or title to be treated with dignity. We draw the line today." It didn't take long. By sunrise, conservative media declared the speech a declaration of war against law enforcement. One senator publicly called for Monroe's resignation. An anonymous Navy official leaked a memo suggesting Celeste should be formally removed from all advisory roles pending review. At a press conference, even the president was asked if Admiral Monroe had gone too far. He paused before answering. "She spoke her truth. That's not going too far. That's America." It wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't a condemnation either, and sometimes silence in the face of injustice is more revealing than words. In a secure building in D.C., a retired intelligence contractor reviewed surveillance metadata, emails, phone logs, travel records. His assignment? Find something. Anything. On Celeste Monroe. Not for national security. Not for legal inquiry. But for optics. For ammunition. For leverage. Because Monroe wasn't just a critic. She was a symbol. And symbols are more complex to bury than scandals. What they found, however, was a problem. There was nothing. No scandals, no corruption, no careless mistakes. Just a life of quiet integrity, precise service, and quiet defiance. That was when they realized something even more dangerous. They hadn't created the storm. They had woken it up. Celeste's phone rang at 2:11 a.m. It wasn't a politician, not a journalist, not an activist. It was her former executive officer, now a rear admiral in the Pacific Fleet. "Celeste," he said, voice low, "I've been asked to distance myself from you. Let me guess. They're reviewing your public alignment." "Exactly. And the second I hang up, this call never happened." She was quiet. "Then why call at all?" "Because I want you to know. You're not alone. There are more of us. We've just been waiting for someone to go first." The following day, 5 high-ranking officers, all retired, released a joint op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "Why Admiral Monroe is Right." It was concise, blistering, and impossible to ignore. Justice in uniform must not be selective. Recognition cannot precede respect. When Admiral Monroe spoke, she did so with the weight of every quiet injustice this country has let pass by. The op-ed was followed by public endorsements from professors, judges, state attorneys general, and even a few police chiefs who had once stayed out of the spotlight. The battle was no longer symbolic. It had structure, names, ranks, faces. Celeste stared at a wall of pinned articles, transcripts, photos, and timelines in her home office. Maya leaned against the doorway. "We're getting emails from defense departments abroad, asking if they can replicate the Monroe testimony model. The Justice Department wants to meet. CNN just asked for an exclusive." Celeste didn't turn. "It's not about TV. It's about traction. What now?" She finally looked up. "Now, we put the entire system on notice." When Admiral Celeste Monroe walked into the federal courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama, the marble echoed with more than footsteps. It echoed with history. This was the same courthouse where generations earlier, black citizens had been sentenced under Jim Crow laws, where justice had been a stage for theater, not truth. And now, a 61-year-old black woman, admiral, widow, mother, was about to turn that same courtroom into a crucible. Not for revenge, for the record. Suspended and stripped of his badge, Officer Douglas Raines sat at the defendant's table. Pale, hollow-eyed, dressed in a suit 2 sizes too big, as if shrinking into himself could rewrite what he'd done. His defense attorney tried to shift the narrative. "It was a misunderstanding," they said. "My client feared for his safety." There was no malice, just protocol. But every witness told a different story. Colonel Avery Langston testified that Raines refused to lower his weapon even after identifying Monroe by name. Major Evelyn Ramos described the gut punch of disbelief she felt watching Raines force Monroe to her knees while the folded flag for a fallen soldier was still cradled in her arms. But the moment that pierced the courtroom like a blade came when Maya took the stand. She was poised, polished. But when she looked across the courtroom at the man who had leveled a gun at her mother, her hands shook. "She raised me to believe the uniform meant something," Maya said softly. "That it stood for duty, for honor. That if you did the right thing, you were protected." She paused, swallowing emotion. "But that day, watching my mother kneel in her dress whites, not because she had done something wrong, but because she was seen as wrong." Her voice caught. "I stopped believing that." The room went still. Not because of the law, but because of the silence. And I knew we were complicit if I stayed silent, too. She ended with a line that would later go viral on every platform. "He pointed a gun at a general, but what shattered was a daughter's belief in justice." When it was her turn to speak, Admiral Monroe didn't take the stand. She took the floor. No notes. No rehearsed lines. Her voice is firm, textured with experience, and carved by years of service. "I'm not here to destroy a man," she began. "I'm here to rebuild a principle." She turned toward the jury. "This case isn't about a traffic stop, misunderstanding, or even a personal insult. It's about what happens when unchecked power meets unexamined bias. Her eyes swept the room. It's about a system that teaches some men their authority is absolute, and teaches others, like me, that dignity must be earned. I have served in 3 wars, buried soldiers, carried their names in my prayers. But the deepest wound I've ever received wasn't from enemy fire. It was being treated like one in my own country. Silence. Then a single cough. Then nothing. I don't want vengeance. I want accountability. For every mother, every service member, every person who walks into a room and is met first with suspicion and second with silence. She nodded once to the judge. That is all. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty. On all counts. Unlawful use of force, willful misconduct under color of law, and violation of civil rights. Raines was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, stripped of pension, and barred from ever serving in law enforcement again. Some said it was too lenient, others said it was political. But Celeste didn't say anything at all. Not because she was angry, because she was finished with the noise. Monroe was scheduled to speak 2 weeks later at the rededication of the Arlington Monument for fallen women in service. The day was warm. Blue sky stretches endlessly over polished white stone. Just before her speech, she stood quietly, watching academics file into formation. Girls with braids tucked into caps. The boys stood nervously tall. She smiled. The crowd quieted as she approached the podium. Some say moments like these are about closure, she began. But there is no closing what still echoes. I stood at a funeral and was profiled by a man who wore the same uniform I once saluted. And that moment became a mirror for a nation, for a culture, for a system. We have choices now. She gestured to the monument behind her. We honor those who gave their lives, but the greater honor is ensuring the living don't have to suffer for their silence. She closed with a line that would be carved in bronze outside the newly built Monroe Institute for Ethical Leadership. Courage isn't just facing fire. It's standing still while the world trembles around you and refusing to kneel unless it's in honor. A 4-star admiral, in full uniform, at a soldier's funeral, and they still drew a gun on her. Let that sink in. Admiral Celeste Monroe didn't raise her voice. She didn't run. She didn't pose a threat. All she did was stand still. Mourn. And somehow, in the eyes of a police sergeant, that was enough to be treated like a criminal. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment confusion. This wasn't about protocol. This was about perception, about power, about a system so warped, so emboldened by its impunity, that it would dare hold a decorated officer at gunpoint while standing over the casket of a fallen hero. And if that doesn't make your blood boil, it should. Because if Celeste Monroe, an admiral, a leader, a woman whose name is etched into American military history, can be profiled at Arlington, then what chance does a young black man have on a quiet street at night? What chance does a student have of walking home? A mother driving her kids? A veteran out of uniform? This story isn't just about Celeste. It's about all of us. It's about the fear that walks hand in hand with skin color. About how power clings to the illusion that uniforms only deserve respect when certain people wear them. It's about the quiet violence of a finger resting on a trigger, backed not by justice, but by assumption. And what happened next? Celeste didn't shrink. She didn't retaliate. She did something even more dangerous to a system built on silence. She spoke. Before Congress. Before the country. Before the very institutions that tried to discredit her. She brought receipts. She demanded reform. She refused to let the moment die in headlines. And because of her, the story didn't end in shame. It started a movement. But that movement needs you. Because here's the truth. Real change doesn't come from hashtags. It comes from outrage that doesn't fade. From people like you who choose not to look away. who decides to speak, vote, challenge, and remember. So if you feel even an ounce of the injustice in this story, don't let it stop at anger. Turn it into action. Hit the like button if you believe no one should ever have to prove their worth to be treated with dignity. Comment below with your thoughts, outrage, and support for Admiral Monroe and everyone who's been profiled, dismissed, and disrespected. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that hold power accountable and shine a light where others want darkness, because silence protects systems, but stories like this, they break them. And we're just getting started.